They came in the coldest winter the village had seen in a generation, when the rivers froze solid and the cattle coughed blood before dropping to the dirt. Elian had buried his mother the week before, bare hands, no shovel under the roots of a tree that cracked like bone in the frost. The church bell hadn't rung in days, silenced by fever or fear. Hunger made monsters out of neighbors. When the war riders came, there wasn't much left to burn, but they took what they could. Elian hid beneath a ruined altar, where once priests spoke Latin he didn't understand. His fingers clutched the only thing that remained of his charm his mother had carved, shaped like a moon, worn smooth by prayer and time. He was found not by a soldier, but by a man in fine robes, red-stitched with wolves and suns, eyes sunken with grief that looked deeper than madness. The man didn't shout. He only stared, then whispered a name. Julian, and fell to his knees. Before Elian could speak, he was dragged out by servants in linen gloves. "It's him," the man wept. "My son, returned by divine will," and Elian, too weak to resist, was taken. On the journey, no one spoke to him. He was washed with scented oils, dressed in robes too large, and forbidden to speak anything but Latin prayers. His hair was cut. His hands were rubbed with chalk to seem paler. They called him Julian, and when he refused to respond, they beat him softly, not to bruise his face. The nobleman, Duke Aurelius, said God had offered a miracle, his drowned son reborn in the body of a peasant. The clergy agreed. They spoke of prophecy, signs in the sky, and visions of Rome restored. The priests wept more than they prayed. When they reached the stronghold, high in the mountains, Elian saw walls taller than trees and guards dressed as Roman centurions. Fires burned day and night. A great hall had been built in mockery of Roman basilicas, with pillars painted gold and statues of long-dead emperors glaring from the corners, and in the center, a throne that had not belonged to any ruler in living memory. The Duke placed Elian on it and commanded everyone to kneel. "Julian has returned," he declared. "Rome breathes again." From that moment, Elian vanished. Every hour was a ritual. Woken before dawn, he was forced to wear heavy tunics, memorize Latin verse, and bow before relics said to contain the bones of saints. He was denied meat, denied mirrors, denied words in his mother's tongue. The servants whispered that he had once been born of dirt, but the Duke had made him holy. A child made into a symbol. The boy emperor, reborn. Even his voice was shaped by force, trained higher, disciplined lower, whichever suited the lie best. He was forbidden to speak his real name. Names hold power, the monks warned. Say the wrong one, and you lose your soul. He thought of running, but the gates were iron, the snows too deep, and his body too thin from the constant fasting that the Duke called Roman discipline. Sometimes, during cold baths meant to purify him, he caught his reflection in water. He didn't recognize the face that looked back. The bindings under his robes left marks on his skin, cruel fabric pulled tight to flatten what nature hadn't decided clearly enough. The monks told him the body was nothing, just a vessel, but they treated it like a shrine. The Duke spoke to him like a ghost. "Julian," he'd whisper, "drunk on wine and incense, you look just like he did when he was 12. The same sorrow in your eyes, even the same fingers." He'd kiss Elian's hand and cry, trembling with grief that stank of madness. Elian said nothing. Saying anything risked punishment, and silence had become his only shield. Soon, visitors began arriving. Lesser nobles, bishops, even poets who believed the myth. They called him divine, the last light of the empire. Some wrote songs about his return. Others wept in his presence. He was not a boy to them. He was a prophecy in skin. His hunger, his silence, his obedience, interpreted as holiness. Once, a scribe passed him a note beneath a scroll. "Do you remember who you were?" But the note was found, and the scribe vanished that night. The castle became a shrine too. Fiction. Every wall bore images of emperors and saints with young faces. Candles burned before statues of him carved too quickly. A monk began chronicling the second coming of Julian, writing false memories, inventing noble deeds. Elian read one by accident. In it, he had healed a blind child and spoken to angels. He dropped the scroll in vomit. At night, he cried, in silence, not because he was lonely, but because he wasn't. The Duke was always watching, the monks always whispering, the servants always obeying. And Guy, the silent eunuch servant, who cleaned his robes, never looked him in the eye, but moved like someone who'd lived this before. Elian once asked him, in a whisper, "Were you someone else?" Guy didn't answer, but he touched a place where his own name might have been, long ago. Elian no longer thought of seasons. Time passed only in rituals. He was nothing more than a pageant dressed in flesh, paraded for a dream of Rome that had died 1,000 years before. Once, during a rite, a candle fell and burned his robe. The court gasped, not because he was hurt, but because the illusion had faltered. A monk cried that it was an omen. The Duke declared it a test from God. After that, they made him wear a circlet of thorns. The hunger returned. His cough worsened. The bindings grew tighter, but he said nothing. He stood when told. He smiled when told. And inside, he whispered his true name, Elian, over and over, until it became a prayer only he could hear. The days became indistinguishable from each other, marked only by the ringing of bells that echoed through stone corridors like commands from gods no one had seen. Every hour of Julian's life was dictated by schedule, every gesture scrutinized for signs of divine favor. He was expected to walk, speak, even breathe, with grace. When he coughed, the monks said it was a test. When he bled, they called it a cleansing. Nothing was allowed to be merely human. Meals were sparse, mostly broth and dry bread. Meat was denied to him for fear it would corrupt his holy essence. The others in the keep ate separately, and even Guy, who quietly slid a piece of cheese or soft fruit his way now and then, did so with the careful fear of someone who knew that kindness could be mistaken for blasphemy. Julian was never alone, yet entirely isolated, surrounded by guards who bowed too low, priests who crossed themselves too often, and pages who looked at him like a sacred text they feared to read aloud. His robes changed with the season, but not their weight or restriction. They were laced tight, layered in symbolism, meant to signify purity, sacrifice, and lineage. The bindings beneath remained unchanged, and his ribs had begun to bruise. Still, he was expected to kneel for hours during rites without complaint, hands lifted in silent imitation of ancient martyr poses. Pain was mistaken for poise, exhaustion for humility. The Duke rarely addressed him directly now. He sat upon his imitation of a Roman dais, speaking of empire and glory to foreign guests. He introduced Julian as the emperor who returned and recited lines from Virgil and Augustine as proof of divine fate. When Julian was asked to speak, he was only to repeat memorized verses in Latin. Any hesitation was met with fasting, any deviation with lashes. Visitors came more often, bringing gifts, relics, coins, even locks of hair to be blessed. A bishop once traveled across the Alps just to witness him perform a benediction, then declared it a miracle that his voice had neither man's power nor woman's softness. The court celebrated, but Julian felt only hollowness. His voice was not a miracle. It was shaped by trauma, pressure, and silence. Disease moved through the servants like a slow curse. 2 maids disappeared in a week, and their absence was never explained. One guard collapsed during a morning drill, and was dragged away by monks chanting psalms. Julian noticed how the sick were never named again, never mentioned. The keep was rotting from within, but the illusion was maintained with fresh paint, holy songs, and tightened discipline. A new boy was brought in, barely 10, thin and nervous, intended to be trained as Julian's attendant. His resemblance to a saint's statue was enough justification. He was shaved, bathed, renamed, and kept nearby. Julian watched it unfold with quiet horror, recognizing each stage: the loss of name, the reshaping of posture, the hunger that would be called purification. The boy did not cry, and that silence was the most terrifying part. Julian tried to speak to him once, but a monk saw and ordered him to fast 3 days. He began to understand then that he was not unique. He was a template, a symbol that could be remade in others. There was no sanctity in his suffering, only tradition, one based on erasure. Guy confirmed it without speaking, only by showing scars on his back one night, old and faded but deep. He pointed to Julian's bindings, then to his own chest, then to the new boy's thin frame. A cycle, uninterrupted. Julian's hands began to shake, not from fear but from the effort of maintaining control. He could no longer remember the sound of his mother's voice. Only flashes of her stories remained, gods of forest and moonlight, not emperors or prophets. He tried to hold on to those fragments, repeating them in his head when he was forced to pray aloud. Punishment grew more creative. Once, after dropping a relic during procession, Julian was made to kneel on stone through an entire night, his arms outstretched, holding candles. The monk said the pain purified. The duke said it strengthened the soul. But Julian only felt his body weakening, his thoughts spiraling inward. Each ritual chipped away a piece of him, and there were fewer pieces left to give. Whispers filled the halls. Some said Julian's power protected the keep. Others believed his presence had cursed it. Either way, he remained its center, its prisoner. The walls were adorned with frescoes of saints bearing his face. The scribes had rewritten history to insert his name beside the Caesars, the emperor reborn. But the boy beneath the paint was disappearing. At night, he heard coughing echoing through the halls, servants growing sicker, their sounds suppressed by walls too thick for compassion to pass through. Fires burned continuously to hide the stench of rot. The monks claimed the air was being purified. Julian knew it was a lie. He had smelled death before. Even Guy, once steady and silent, grew slower. One morning, Julian found blood on the servant's sleeve, but no acknowledgement passed between them. They both knew the fate of the sick. Erasure was quicker than death. In rare moments alone, Julian would touch the moon-shaped charm hidden in the lining of his robe, the only thing that tied him to another life. It had survived washing, binding, and inspection. It was not power, not protection, only memory. Some days, he feared losing even that. The memory of being alien was fading. Each ritual, each forced word in a dead tongue, erased another syllable of his true self. And still, they called him holy. They praised the clarity in his eyes, the stillness in his manner. No one saw the boy inside, only the emperor they had invented. He learned to mimic their expectations so well that even he began to forget when he was performing and when he was simply enduring. The air grew colder, the stone more damp. Winter returned, and with it, more omens. A falcon died on the parapet. A monk lost his tongue after fever. The duke's speeches became longer, more frantic, and Julian sensed that something was unraveling. The court clung harder to ritual, more processions, more penance, more demands for perfection. But perfection was decaying from the inside. Julian could feel it in his breath, in his bones, in the way his real name came slower to his lips each time he dared whisper it. Snow fell thicker that winter, blanketing the keep in silence that no hymn could break. Fires struggled against the cold, and sickness moved without restraint. The boy brought in as Julian's attendant disappeared one morning, and no one spoke. His name again? Julian noticed fewer footsteps in the corridors, fewer candles lit, more cold spots left unguarded. Servants whispered behind cloaks. Rumors of rebellion, distant towns breaking from the duke's rule, nobles turning their loyalty to Rome or Constantinople. The illusion was cracking. not from battle, but from within. Julian's own body became harder to command. His cough worsened. His hands trembled more often, and fasting took longer to recover from. The priests insisted he must renew his purity through longer rituals and stricter silence. His bindings grew tighter to maintain the appearance they demanded. One monk measured his waist daily, muttering that the emperor's form must not waver from the sacred proportions. He bled often now, but that too was repackaged into myth. A drop of his blood was captured on linen and declared a relic. The bishop from the south claimed it cured a child's blindness. Julian didn't ask how. He knew there'd be no answer that made sense. The Duke changed. Where once he wept and trembled at Julian's presence, he now watched with detachment, measuring every word, correcting every syllable. His belief had turned brittle. He began consulting harsher priests, ones who spoke of cleansing rot and purging false prophets. Julian was no longer seen as a returned son, but as a vessel whose utility had limits. His resemblance to the original Julian was fading, or perhaps the Duke's madness was. Either way, Julian was no longer perfect enough to maintain the dream. Then came the ceremony, the ritual the court had been whispering about for weeks. A winter solstice observance meant to restore divine favor and heal the sick. Julian was ordered to bless the keep while stripped of all but the thinnest robe, standing beneath the snow with arms spread like wings. The ceremony was supposed to reenact ancient Roman purity rites, twisted now into something half Christian, half pagan. The crowd of nobles, clergy, and soldiers watched in silence as he was pushed into the snow, his skin already bruised from bindings. He stood there for hours. No one moved to help, not even Guy. Afterward, his feet were raw, his lips blue, his breath shallow. He collapsed, but the Duke declared it a successful rite. "He bears the weight of our sins," the monks shouted. Julian heard none of it. In his mind, he repeated one wordly and till it became a drumbeat against the silence they forced upon him. That night, fever took him. He dreamed of his mother's stories, but her face was gone, replaced by marble, statues and frescoes painted in his likeness. He awoke to find his hair being cut again. His voice was hoarse, his body colder than before. Then a turning point. A servant girl left a mirror near his cot, likely by accident. Julian looked and didn't recognize himself, the face staring. Back was gaunt, hollow-eyed lips, chapped, skin discolored from binding scars. The face of a ghost. Not Julian, not emperor, not divine. Just lost, just used. Something broke inside him then. Not a scream, not a sob. Something quieter. A refusal to continue believing any of it. That evening, he refused to kneel during evening rites. The priests gasped. The Duke watched him with disgust. Julian said nothing. The silence lasted long enough to be called defiance. They dragged him to the lower crypt stamp, cold, used once for prisoners. A monk recited charges against him: pride, heresy, falsehood, deception. A trial would follow, but its outcome had already been written. He would be broken, then rebuilt. Again days passed. He was denied food. The cell had no fire. Rats scratched in the walls. The bindings were removed only to be replaced with heavier cloth that prevented movement. When Guy came once to bring water, Julian looked at him and whispered, "This is what they did to you." Guy did not deny it. He placed a hand on Julian's shoulder and mouthed one word: escape. Julian knew it wasn't a plan. It was a mercy, a whisper of something beyond ritual. That night, he used a shard of bone to scratch words into the wall of the cell. My name was Elian. I was never Julian. I was never emperor. It was the first true sentence he had written in years. When the priests returned, they forced him into penance. A procession through the keep, barefoot, chained, his head bowed. The court watched in silence. The Duke announced that the boy would be reborn through humility. Julian heard the clinking of chains, and thought only of how cold the stone was under his skin. He refused to speak. They wanted confession. He gave silence. They wanted remorse. He gave stillness. They took him back to the tower higher this time, where the wind howled and frost coated the windows. No visitors were allowed. He was to be left in solitude until divine clarity returned. But Julian knew what that meant. He was no longer holy, only forgotten. That night, he pressed his hand against the stone wall and felt nothing. No God, no ghost, no salvation. Only the quiet knowledge that he existed still, somewhere beneath the robes, the scars, the invented rituals. He had endured longer than they expected, and even if no one ever spoke his true name again, it had been carved once, spoken once, remembered once. That would have to be enough. The wind on the tower howled like it had learned to scream from those locked within. Snow piled against the stone windows, and the only sound inside was breath, shallow and slow. Julian sat wrapped in thin cloth, no fire, no food for 2 days. The silence no longer frightened him. It felt familiar, now, like language he had been forced to learn fluently. When they stopped sending monks to test his faith, when no one came with verses or relics, he knew what it meant. They had moved on. The court no longer needed him. Another symbol, another child, another myth could be crafted. The illusion continued, but not with him. Down in the great hall, the Duke was preparing for a new ceremony. This one to purify the keep and name a new figurehead. Rumor had it the boy who once attended Julian too young, too sickly, had been replaced with another, taller and clearer-eyed. The resemblance mattered more than the soul beneath it. The lie had legs. It would keep walking. Guy had not returned in days. Julian feared the worst, but knew better than to ask. Those who disappeared rarely received farewells. In the tower, he began marking days with blood from cracked fingers. He wrote names on the wall, not only his own, but those he remembered. The village priest who hid medicine under the altar. The boy who was beaten for smiling too wide. The maid who once hummed while she worked. Each name was a rebellion. He would not let them vanish entirely. Then, the bishop returned. Not the kind who wept and kissed relics, but the kind whose voice carried like a knife, and who saw disobedience as disease. Julian was dragged from the tower. The road was long. Julian did not speak. The guard didn't either. When they passed burned villages and fields of blackened grain, neither looked away. When they stopped by a frozen stream, Julian caught his reflection once more. It was a stranger's face. Not the emperor, not the heretic, not even Elian, just a human shaped and reshaped so many times that nothing remained but bones and silence. The monastery stood like a grave in the wilderness. Its stone walls bore no banners, no bells, only the weight of everything that had been discarded. The monks did not welcome him. They pointed to a cell, handed him a crust of bread, and closed the door. Time vanished again. Days became indistinct. He was given no books, no parchment, no voice, just stillness. Inside that silence, something stirred. Not hope, not strength, just memory. He began whispering his name again, not aloud, but within. Elian, not Julian, not vessel, not symbol, just Elian, a boy taken from frost and plague, mistaken for prophecy, turned into fiction, and erased when the story no longer served. He repeated it each day, like a prayer with no God left to hear. Years passed. Seasons shifted, but the monastery changed little. Julian grew older. His bones remained sharp beneath his skin, his hands calloused from meaningless labor. He was forgotten by the world. No records named him. The chronicles spoke only of a failed boy emperor who turned to darkness. The keep that once worshipped him fell to rebellion. Its walls burned, its statues smashed. The Duke was executed. A new order took its place, and with it, News stories. No one came looking for Julian when his body finally gave out one winter night. No monk noticed until morning. They buried him behind the monastery, with no name carved into stone, just earth over earth. His charmed moon carved by his mother, still hidden in his robe, unnoticed, unvalued. In a world built on symbols, it was the only thing that had truly belonged to him. Centuries later, the records of the monastery would mention only that a boy arrived from a disgraced noble court, lived without incident, and died unknown. No mention of who he had been forced to be, no hint of what he had survived. The myth of the boy emperor lived on elsewhere. Paintings showed him in gold, flanked by saints. Poets wrote of a divine youth who tempted Rome's return and fell into heresy. His name was spoken only as caution, but Elian was never mentioned. Not once. And so he faded, not in fire, not in glory, but in quiet, not remembered, not mourned, just gone. But somewhere, in a cracked stone wall, deep in the mountains, there still remained the lines scratched in blood and bone. My name was Elian. I was never Julian. I was never emperor.